to you.
Thank you, Joanna, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for your interest in dyslexia and its effects on folks, its causes, etc. What I'd like to cover tonight is, first of all, what happens in the brain, in the brains of people who have dyslexia. So we're looking at brain function and how the brains of people with dyslexia differ from those without dyslexia. We'll also be looking at the causes of dyslexia that we understand through research today. We'll be looking at what risk factors that might indicate that a child has dyslexia. And I want to talk particularly about scientifically based reading instruction, because we have a great deal, while there's much more to research about the brain and dyslexia's effect on the brain, we have very good data on how scientifically based reading instruction is good for all students, and in many cases can prevent some reading difficulties that students develop. We'll talk about how dyslexia is diagnosed and what you can do to support students at home to help them remediate dyslexia and to help them function as best as they can. So the first thing is just to define dyslexia, what it actually is. And dyslexia is a brain-based disorder, and it results from the difficulty of processing sounds in language. By that I mean being able to listen to and process different sounds in language, sounds in words. It may not affect someone's ability to speak or language development per se, but it most definitely affects an individual's ability to learn to connect the sounds in language to the letters that represent them in written language. So it will affect the ability to learn to read, to write, and to spell. And if you look at all the learning disabilities that are that we know of, dyslexia accounts for about 80% of those. So it is, among learning disabilities, it's very prevalent. It may also exist alongside other brain-based difficulties such as ADHD or depression or so on. However, it is a very specific difficulty that does not define an entire person. And so Sally Shaywitz, who is a major researcher and writer on the topic of dyslexia, who currently directs a Center for Creativity and Dyslexia at Yale University, called dyslexia an unexpected weakness in a sea of strength. And we'll be looking at some of those strengths as we go along tonight. So if you look at people at, given a whole population, about 20% of people, in any given cohort, will have some phonological coding difficulties. By that I mean being able to decode or encode matching sounds with the symbols that represent them. So about 10 to 13% of that 20% have some difficulty, but can usually be pretty well remediated. But then there are about 7 to 10% who have much more serious difficulties with processing sounds and may have other issues, language-based or cognition-based difficulties that may compound the difficulty with dyslexia. So what, what does dyslexia affect? First of all, and also, what does it take to be a good reader? First of all, there's word recognition. So a good reader has awareness, what we call phonemic awareness, but that's an awareness of sounds separate from letters. We think we're so, after we get to be a fluent reader, the letter patterns in words become so familiar to us that it's hard to disassociate them from the sound. But before children ever learn the phonetic code that we use in English in order to read and write, children have to develop speech and an awareness of the sounds, of the speech sounds. That is what we call phonemic awareness or phonological awareness. And then there's phonics, which is the ability to match our speech sounds to letters that represent those speech sounds, and that's what we call decoding, because we have an alphabetic code that represents speech sounds, and so as a reader we have to break that code in order to learn to read. And then there's also sight word recognition, and by that I mean the ability to look at words and recognize them quickly so that we're not always decoding. We have reached a point where we have a kind of a template for how what words are, what they sound like, and so on, so that we can read pretty much at the speed of sight. And we need to be automatic at it because we have to read fast enough that we can understand what we're reading. Vocabulary is extremely important. We know that the more words a child has when he or she starts school, the better they're going to do with reading and understanding what they read and so on. So so that comes from exposure to reading, exposure to language, and that supports reading comprehension, which is also supported by background knowledge, so that when children read, they have some familiarity with much of what they read about, which also allows them to then make inferences, which is an important skill to be a good reader. Okay, so what you're seeing here, this is the reading, the famous sort of reading rope, or what we sometimes call it is the simple view of reading, which is not really that simple, as you can see. But in order to become a skilled reader, we have to have a number of sub-skills that weave together and work together in order to develop fluent reading. Basically, being able to read, recognize words, understand text, and do it pretty fluently. So we start here down with the word recognition, which has to come first. And we need to children need to be able to recognize syllables, that words are unique pieces, that words can have multiple parts like syllables, and that they can also recognize the sounds that make up a word, so that in a word such as cat, that in fact cat is made up of three sounds, k, a, t, and that in fact sounds blend together to make words. So then that leaves the possibility open for decoding, which means that we can do that the children can then have a correspondence or map sounds to symbols, which allows them not only to read and decode, but also to encode, which is another word for spelling, that they can hear sounds and recognize the sounds and the letters that make those sounds in order for them to be able to write a word. And then in addition, they need to be able to recognize familiar words quite easily, okay? And all of these have to become increasingly automatic. And unfortunately, that's not enough, that's enough to be able to recognize words. But in addition to that, we have to look at the skills of language comprehension. So background knowledge of facts and concepts and stuff, the sort of thing that comes from being read to, from conversations with adults, and experiences that that expose children to information and language and so on, which also builds vocabulary, so that the children begin school with as much word knowledge as possible, and so that they can continue to build on that. They also need to learn language structures and be aware of language structures, so that when they write, they can follow grammar rules. They know how words go together, nouns and verbs and so on, in sentences, and also semantic knowledge. In other words, what the meaning of words are. There may be the one that has multiple meanings, or words that sound alike, but they have different spellings, different meanings. They need to be able to reason. Their verbal reason has to be eventually grow, so that they recognize when there's an inference made, so that they can so-called read between the lines, and can understand language structures such as metaphors. And then they also need to develop literacy knowledge, so that they understand how print works, that there are different rhetorical patterns that print has, so that there might be narrative writing, that there might be essay writing, that there's that there's fiction and nonfiction and so on. All of this gradually weaves together into this nice tight rope that we call skilled reading. And we will talk a little bit more about this later on as we move on. But this is early literacy development and all that it entails. So how is it that people are actually able to read? Because our brains never really evolved for reading. However, we can do it. So partly the reason we can do it is the brain is what we call has plasticity. It's changeable. So our human brains can make new connections, and which enables us to do different kinds of things with our brain. So, for example, before there was before the Greeks invented their very clever alphabet, which we base our alphabet on now, the main communication device or way of teaching was through an oral tradition, passing down oral stories, information, questioning, and so on. If you've ever heard of the Socratic method, that was Socrates, who walked around with his students and constantly asked questions and stuff. When writing came into being, using the Greek alphabet in order to write things down, Socrates was beside himself. He said, if we can write everything down, we don't have to remember things. Well, so in fact, that, being able to write opened up a huge store, a huge knowledge base for people, because they could read things that other people had written and so on. But in fact, that oral tradition, that ability to remember things so clearly, kind of, dropped out of use to some extent. So, but the brain was able to make these connections between sounds and symbols, and now enabling people to write words and sentences and so on. So what the brain does, because as I said, the brain did not develop for us to read. It got big because we, of course, had, we're developing tools, and we developed our famous opposable thumbs and so on. And lo and behold, we were able to recycle some of the neurons, the neuronal circuits that are used for oral language, and it was able to accommodate written language. So our written language is very much based in our speech patterns, which have to come first before, so that we can then take advantage of the coding, the alphabetic code, to be able to read and write. So there are various things that, in terms of developing readers, it's which I think is important to look at, that one really huge factor in reading development and language development in general is reading to children. And what that does is, first of all, it allows children to listen to sounds in words. They hear the sounds in the words, and they hear a number of words, and they're able to register that. It also leads to vocabulary development, because generally in writing we find more robust vocabulary than in spoken language, which tends to be somewhat telegraphic. They learn that words have relationships with one another in sentences. And then, of course, one of my favorites is Frog and Toad and their wonderful friendship, because that demonstrates, how two people can differ but understand each other's perspective. So there's a sort of an emotional development through that process as well. So as literacy develops, the brain changes. It rearranges itself. And the neurons in areas of the brain, particularly in the visual cortex, become specialized. And so over time, in the first 5 to 8 years of a child's life, the specialized neurons develop and then become what we call myelinated, which means that the neurons are coated with myelination, which is actually a layer of fat, and kind of stabilize the neural circuitry. And when that occurs, children are neurologically ready to learn to read. So that early development in literacy is extremely important. Here you can see the scans. One of the things that all of our technology has allowed researchers to do is actually look at neural activity in the brain as people are reading or talking or whatever. And here you can see that people who have not learned to read, their activation around written sentences is very low. And they, there's also some spoken language neural circuitry around that. However, even in people who are adults who learn to read, their brains change so that there's much more activity around reading sentences and still some around spoken sentences. And those who learn to read as children actually have a similar pattern to even those who just learn to read. So it's never too late for someone to learn to read. And you can see the difference between literate and illiterate. There's much more brain activity going on here than over in the illiterate side. So what has to happen in terms of language development in order to read happens at different levels. So there's kind of an acronym called possum, which helps remember some of this, which is a little bit complicated. But first of all, there has to be the sound structure of the language has to become salient or available to children. They have to be able to hear the sounds and the fact that there are words, there are syllables, there are sentences, so on. Then there's the orthographic parts, orthography, which is basically recognizing letters and the patterns that those letters form. So that, for example, one example of this is one I was just working on with some students today, which is words like make and bake and ate and so on. In other words, a vowel pattern with a vowel, the E being silent, making the vowel say its name, or what we call a long vowel. And that's a linguistic pattern that that children will learn as they are learning to read. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for them to sort all that out. Semantics, the meaning of words, absolutely crucial, of course. The meaning of things is many ways, it's the goal of all of these other parts, as well as syntax. In other words, how words combine in connected text. The fact that subjects, there's a subject, there's a verb, there are nouns and verbs and adjectives, that written language can occur in sentences and paragraphs and even longer passages. And then also, which we sometimes forget about, thinking, oh, phonics, we have to pay attention to that, but we also have to pay attention to morphemes, which are word roots, prefixes, and suffixes, which can change the meaning of a base word simply by making it plural, by using a prefix like un, which means not, and changes the meaning of the word completely. All of these are elements of language that need to be developed and recognized in written language. So here's the reading brain, and you see the front of the brain, the frontal lobe there. Where things get started is back here in the back of the brain, where there's an occipital lobe, which is where word and letter recognition happen. So in other words, there's in the back of the brain, the occipital lobe allows us to see an image, which seems funny because the eyes are in the front, and you think, well, how is the back of the brain doing that? But it is connecting to the eyes. And And then is where letter word recognition. And over here in the parietal lobe is where we're going to find where word analysis, where there's a sound symbol connection, recognizing that that there's a CAT. And the temporal lobe, in the temporal lobe is the language comprehension, which tells a reader that there's a cat there. And then speech sounds, at, will occur here in the frontal lobe. So what we have here is a very complicated loop in order to read, and it has to happen very, very fast. So initially, when children begin to learn to read, they learn slowly because they're laying down a neurocircuitry connection, connecting these areas of the brain. And as with more practice, it gets very, very fast, so they can read what seems like, instantaneously. So here we can look at the what happens in the brain of non-impaired brains, in other words, brains without dyslexia. And what you see here in the reading brain over on the left here is you see this circular kind of action that's going on from one area to another. And if you look in the middle section, this is from an fMRI scan, which shows that there's lots of neural activity going on in the left side of the brain because it's engaged in all of this circuit, which connects the visual letters to the sounds, to the meaning, and that's all happening here. Now, in this image over with readers with dyslexia, what you're seeing is there is some activity, but it's really only in the front of the brain, and the back of the brain is which should be receiving messages from the right side of the brain in terms of imagery and so on, but the structures aren't activated there, and so those messages don't come through. Consequently, that complete circuit that's necessary in order to read isn't fully occurring. Now, and just one more demonstration of this, goes a little slower, is here we have the occipital lobe in the back of the brain, and that's where the letters are identified visually. And then we have the area that processes the semantic area, Wernicke's area, that processes the meaning of sounds and words so that you understand what's being heard. And here is the processing of sounds of the language to create speech. So here, with the visual letter identification, we're seeing a CAT. And in Wernicke's area, we're having the meaning, and there's a visual image of a cat. So we have some meaning. And over here in Broca's, we have a k, t, so that those speech sounds can be blended, and these letters are then decoded into the word cat, which has a meaning. And that is a simplified version of what's basically happening. And okay, here again, you'll see brain activity in impaired readers where we don't see much going on the left side of the brain. We do see stuff going on here on the right side of the brain, trying to pick up where the left side's not able to function, but areas that are activated here in non-impaired readers are not activated here in impaired readers or dyslexic readers. All right, so I want to stop here and just before we go into what causes this, Joanna, are there questions that have come up in the chat that might be worth addressing?
I have not received any chats yet, so if anybody out there has any questions, please submit them.
Okay, great. And so then I'll move on to what are the causes of dyslexia? And dyslexia, the causes of dyslexia are, we've identified a number of things that could occur. Essentially, dyslexia is the result of a brain glitch. Now, where does that glitch occur? Well, it can occur in a number of areas. There can be a glitch in the genes, genetics, and there is some heritability of dyslexia if it occurs in families. Then there could be some neurons or circuits in the brain that are disrupted or not making connections. And that might be because there are some neural structures in the brain that interfere with circuitry, and that can happen like small, what they call ectopias that may throw off the circuitry. And perceptual motor processing may affect the sound, the phonological or sound processing, and some cognitive issues may affect reading as well. And so, which could include language processing or so on. So that, you know, and here is Marianne Wolf, who is another, you know, another eminent researcher, reading researcher, created this visual in her book, Proust and the Squid, which is a wonderful explanation of how reading works. You know, this could occur in the genetic foundation, could be affected, which could be a cause. The neurons and circuits, if they're not passing circuitry, electricity from one neuron to another, that could disrupt something like reading, phonological processing, etc., speed of processing. There are neural structures that may affect the circuitry, so it doesn't go as smoothly as it could. And then within the you know, there could be sensory motor issues, perceptual motor that may affect somebody, and also the cognitive processes. And then there's just the behavioral level of being able to handle all this text, all of this, and it may be some combination of that. So each person is, you know, again, we know as an individual, it's difficult to know with for sure what it is that's actually causing the dyslexia. And there are plenty of researchers working on that to see if there's some way to interrupt a dysfunctional pattern of brain development that's going to impact reading and spelling, but we don't have that yet. So there are a lot of misconceptions about dyslexia that I think it's important to dispel. First of all, there's in the past, when kids couldn't learn to read, they were often sat in the corner with a dunce cap on, or, you know, treated as though they were stupid. And in fact, dyslexia has no relation to IQ. There are eminent and geniuses, in fact, who have had dyslexia and gone on to invent things and solve math puzzles and all kinds of things. So IQ is not affected by dyslexia. It's not uncommon, as you saw before. Up to 20% of people in different, and this goes cross-culturally, are likely to have dyslexia. It shows up in English-speaking people probably more than in some other languages, because English has such a very crazy spelling patterns that that become difficult to understand. Whereas simpler languages, more transparent languages, like say Italian, people can overcome the decoding problems that they have pretty easily, because there's only so many sounds and symbols that are related. But that's not true in English, because English is made of, up to 4 different languages coming together. There's a myth that it's rare in females. That's not true. It happens in females. There might be a slight, it may occur slightly more frequently in males, but there are plenty of females who have dyslexia. Some people think, oh, it's motivation. If he really tried, he could do it. Well, that's not true. That's ridiculous. Sometimes, though, after, you can imagine if someone sits in a schoolroom and everyone else is reading except that child could well begin to figure, why do I even bother? I'm not going to be able to do it. So of course, that there's a real cycle of failure that affects children that can lead to depression and anxiety, and school phobia, all kinds of things. But those are secondary, really, to the original cause, which is, of course, dyslexia. People also think that reversing letters is a sign of dyslexia. That is not true. It is true that you see that letter reversal probably goes on for a longer period of time in children who are dyslexic. But all children reverse letters when they're first learning to write. It's a developmental phase, and that children grow out of. For those who have dyslexia, their development of writing is delayed, so their letter reversals will last longer. And by and large, if they have really good intervention, that will pass out of, they'll get over that pretty easily. It is not caused by visual impairments, and various tracking therapies and so on that are recommended in some cases are not going to help dyslexia. So I strongly encourage people to stay away from treatments that supposedly deal with visual issues. And dyslexia really cannot be outgrown or cured. Now, it can be managed. Good interventions can teach people to read and write and be very functional, but it will leave some. There'll be some evidence of it. Generally, most particularly, reading will be slower and more effortful, so that someone with dyslexia may learn to read pretty well, but they'll get tired sooner. Fortunately, we have excellent technology now which can read to a number of programs and apps and so on will read text to people, and they can easily follow along, and it just breaks down that barrier that dyslexia creates and allows people to read and understand, so that they can be educated and reach their potential. And there are strengths in dyslexia too. sometimes there's a little bit of controversy around some of this, particularly, but people with dyslexia often show a real heightened awareness of space. This is true a lot. There are a number of athletes that have dyslexia, and they are brilliant athletes. They may well have a better sense of where they are in space, so that they can run basketball plays and football plays and so on that some of the rest of us find very difficult to do. There's also, it's not uncommon to see people with dyslexia who have really great mechanical aptitude, who can just, they don't necessarily need to read the manual to be able to fix something or put something together. They just can do it. There is creative approaches to problem solving. Oftentimes, people with dyslexia kind of think outside of the box because they've had to learn to do that in order to solve problems and figure things out. Often connect pieces of a puzzle. And you will find also a certain amount of artistic expression. Some people with dyslexia have been through our history have been brilliant artists, although they also have dyslexia. So some of these things, we think perhaps people with dyslexia really have a somewhat different pattern of brain organization, which allows them perhaps to see things in more 3 dimensions as opposed to 2 dimensions, which people without dyslexia tend to see. But it's a little bit controversial. I don't know that we've proven this exactly, but it certainly is a common phenomenon. And dyslexia is like everything else exists on the, so there's mild dyslexia to very severe dyslexia. So the severity of the dyslexia will determine what kind of an intervention is needed. And so some people with dyslexia who do not have severe dyslexia can often, and they don't have a lot of compounding issues, can often be, with careful intervention, can learn to read quite well. Then there are those who are very severe, and their interventions will take longer and may not be as complete, but they will be better, and they will be better prepared at least to use the available technology to fulfill their potential as well. So what are the risk factors for dyslexia? One could be a family history of delayed speech and language or literacy problem. As I said, there is a genetic component. Things to notice: if a child, by the age of 4, if a child has difficulty recognizing rhymes or can think of rhymes, that's a sign of, that can be a sign of not necessarily hearing, completely recognizing the sound patterns in language. And by the end of kindergarten, if children still have errors in naming the letters, that's another sign. And sometimes difficulty finding words needed to express themselves or recognizing familiar words in print, even though they've seen them a number of times. There can be, you can also know if there's difficulty with understanding spoken or written language, can be a sign. Difficulty remembering colors, sequences like numbers, days of the week, seasons, months, etc. And then difficulty with directionality. In other words, if they confuse right and left and up and down, early and late, yesterday and tomorrow, that indicates some confusion with with concepts in language, and then difficulty identifying the sounds in a word. Because, in our language, words just that, you can't tell the sounds real well. So, if a word like the word sun has a child who can't really identify the sounds in the word will just hear it as sun, one particular, as if it's one sound, and that's a sign of written language difficulty. And so just to drive home the point of what it's like to be dyslexic, this is just a slide that shows there's one other, besides the brain scans and so on that researchers use. There's also such a thing as eye tracking, and so an eye tracker can follow someone's eye movements so that you can tell how they're reading, what words they're reading. Do they have to repeat looking at things and so on? And it gives you an idea of how effortful reading is, or how easy it is, straightforward. So here this is just a slide from an eye tracking study, and here's this text, and this is what an eye tracking would look like for a non-dyslexic reader. So what you can see here, the little blue dots indicate how long the reader maybe pauses at a certain point. And so you can see the lines are pretty straightforward. The reader just goes right on and back to read and so on. That's, pretty typical. Now, this is what a dyslexic reader could look like, where you see lots of pauses. And if here we have like vast, spied, trying to figure out syllables and so on. And then you see a pattern of going back and forth, trying to figure things out. So lots of red lines and so on. This gives you an indication of just how difficult, how effortful and exhausting it could be to read text for someone with dyslexia. So another way to see how dyslexia, what the effect is on an individual. Okay, here's another opportunity before we start talking about the science of reading. Are there any questions, in the chat or anything?
Yeah, we did have a few come in. So I'll start off with a question from Molly. There was a slide showing neural pathways of reading and comparing a non-impaired reading brain versus a dyslexic brain. And she's wondering, can the dyslexic brain ever make the same pathways with interventions?
The answer to that is yes, it can. And that's that's what I'm about to talk about. There's been, we've had about 60 years of really intense scientific research on reading and dyslexia and so on. And what we've learned is that a good scientifically based intervention will show that neural patterns change in the brain to look much more like the brains of those who do not have dyslexia. So yes.
Great.
So when I show that slide, it's more looking at someone with dyslexia who's not had any intervention.
Okay. And then kind of related, are there any exercises that help the other parts of the brain to participate in that kind of functioning?
No, not in terms of, there are programs I know that that try to work on improving memory, to work on improving by doing certain kinds of physical exercise. None of that really has shown to be effective. What is the best? The best that we know now is to have instruction by a well-trained, highly trained instructor, teacher, in using instruction. And there are a number of programs that provide that. But anything else, and then lots and lots and lots of practice reading. So there is no quick fix, but there is a lot. I mean, we know so much more about it. And I've been working with students with dyslexia for much my whole career, which is getting to be ridiculously long now. And I've seen, so many students, both young, and old, be able to develop reading skills so that they were really able to pursue their interests and fulfill their potential. So, yeah.
Great.
It's really important not to be, there are always people who are promising quick fixes and immediate results, and it's important to really be careful with those folks, because many of them are not being honest.
Got it. Okay, next question is, does dyslexia make it more difficult to learn a second language?
Yes, it does. It does. Some languages are easier than others, but yes, it's certainly possible to learn a second language. Generally, people with dyslexia, especially learning to read and write a second language, probably just has to go a little slower than somebody who's not dyslexic.
And then a question from another person, does any research show if premature babies are more likely to have dyslexia?
No, not really. Not really. I mean, if a baby has some kind of effect on its brain, and either in utero or in birth, that could affect it. But there's not anything that there's not any research that shows that that's inevitable. So, yeah.
Got it. And then let's see. Tammy is hoping that we'll have some more discussion on how to help people with dyslexia learn how to read and thrive with or through dyslexia.
Sure, that's where we're heading.
Great. And then another comment, developing phonological awareness boils down to a lot of practice with a trained interventionist. So it's more of a statement question.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Actually, children will develop phonological awareness fairly easily if they're exposed to language and are read to, and so on. We are very good at teaching kids, at teaching phonological awareness. I will say that that's something we know how to do quite well, and can often remediate that pretty quickly in most kids.
Okay. And then one more follow-up talking about vision therapy. So it says, so vision therapy will not help a child with dyslexia?
That's, yes, right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then one follow-up about the learning a second language. Do you have a recommendation of a language that would be easier for a student with dyslexia to learn?
Well, I think some of the, I guess it depends, but some of the, like Italian and Spanish are more predictable by a long shot than English is. So, we have Spanish classes at Groves, and I think students definitely can learn a second language. If they, and some colleges require a second language and so on. So what hasn't, in my experience, when children are placed in in a language immersion school who have dyslexia, it's often difficult for them to develop, especially to develop proficiency in English reading and writing. And again, that's just my anecdotal impression, because we have had a number of students come to Groves who have been in immersion schools, and it just really hasn't gone that well. Immersion schools can be, I'm not condemning them at all. It can be a wonderful experience for children, but it depends on the child. And so so I think that's that caveat. But otherwise, I think if students can learn a second language, they can certainly learn it to be fairly facile, and that's again, good instruction, paced properly, is important there.
And what about the spoken language aspect of it? Is that affected by dyslexia?
It can be, because it can be. And again, that varies a great deal. So I've known lots of students who have dyslexia, but their oral language is excellent, and so it's more the written language part that is difficult.
Okay. And then one last question here from Barbara. How about reading genres? Is there one, like nonfiction, fiction, comics, etc., that people with dyslexia have an easier time processing?
Well, I think I think it again. I'm going to reframe that just a little bit. One thing that's really important is that that all students get good exposure to nonfiction. They learn, how different kinds of nonfiction patterns, like compare, contrast, cause and effect, descriptive, things like that. And oftentimes, nonfiction goes, can be, it's important to know for future, studies, and can be, and so on. In general, language arts teachers in the past have spent an awful lot of time on narrative structure, like novels and plays and things, all of which are wonderful, but it's a different narrative. Narrative text is a different animal than expository text, and it's important that students have some experience with expository text. In general, when students are reading independently, and we'll get into that, you have for them to be successful reading independently, they need to be able to read a certain percentage of the words. And so if they're reading independently and they're reading Shakespeare, that's going to be frustrating. And it may be frustrating for anyone, but nonetheless, we'll talk a little bit more about choosing how difficult the text should be and so on.
There were a couple more that popped in real quick.
Sure.
What about reading and playing music? Is that affected by dyslexia? Like trying to decode notes, words?
I think I've known of people with dyslexia who play by ear beautifully and improvise and so on. I think reading music may be affected by dyslexia, may affect the ability to do that. But I don't know a lot of research on that.
And then these two kind of go together. What is the best way to assess how well they progress in their reading? Is it how long do most kids have tutors? And then another one about, is Orton-Gillingham the best method to use?
Well, both of those I'm actually going to get to when we talk, because we're just about to get into what good intervention looks like. And so I'd like to delay answering those until we're right there. But those are great questions and important ones.
Sounds good.
Good. So diving into the science of reading, we've had, as I said, we've had a body of scientific research about reading and writing that has gone on for probably 60 years, that date back to the 60s, and that are based on thousands of studies from across the world and in different languages to show how reading and writing develop and why some people have difficulty. So also this, we also have learned through all these many decades of research how to assess, teach, and improve student outcomes, both prevention and intervention. And I would urge you, if you're interested in this, there is a link here for the Reading League, which is an organization that's devoted to the science of reading and for all children. And it is an excellent organization and has a journal, and I think is of great interest. Also, the International Dyslexia Association, all of these are in the references here too, have lots to say about scientific reading instruction. So basically, we need to base instruction on scientific reading research. And that means cognitive scientists, language specialists, reading researchers, and so on. For the general classroom, instruction is going to move quicker, faster, because it requires less repetition. And that's in the general classroom. However, for intervention for students who are having some difficulties with reading, once again, we have to look to our scientific reading research to determine what kind of instruction is best and what kind of training teachers need. But in terms of intervention, instruction needs to move at the pace that's necessary to serve the student. So when you are working with a student who has some reading difficulties, the importance of having a trained teacher is that teacher can be very observant of where the issues are, what the student is having difficulty with, and also how to use that knowledge to teach diagnostically. In other words, to address the issues that the student is having as the instruction goes along. And so you can't predict really until you get going with the student how long it's going to take, and how successful an intervention is going to be. Instruction, one-on-one instruction or a small group of students is really what you need for an intervention. And it can be in a small group, and that can be quite successful. So there are 5 kind of variables of intervention that depends on where the student falls in that continuum of dyslexia. First of all, it's the intervention itself, which really needs to be based on the science of reading. And some of those are going to be programs that are based on the Orton-Gillingham framework of reading instruction, and that would include things like the Wilson Reading System. There's a traditional Orton-Gillingham instruction, and there are a number of programs that are based on Orton-Gillingham instruction primarily. And our Groves learning partners are all working with a curriculum that was developed specifically for those schools called the Groves method. And it involves some intervention. It's a general classroom and also some tier 2 intervention. The intensity is going to be, again, how intense does it need to be? Does it need, which means, which means how long should the instruction last? And then how frequent should it be? And then a lot is, how long should it be? How intense should it be? In other words, one-on-one or small group. Knowledge and expertise of the teacher is incredibly important. And so you want to be able to, to know what kind of experience and training a teacher has or a tutor that you are, their student is working with. So reading instruction needs to address these 5 areas. And one of them is phonemic awareness, which is the sounds in the words, the phonics, which is the letter sound correspondence, fluency, which is accuracy and speed, in other words, the reading rate, but also expression, how fluent, and then vocabulary development, looking at word meaning as things are going along, and then comprehension. How can you teach students good strategies so that they can understand what they read? So for phonemic awareness, that involves being able to manipulate the sounds in spoken words. So an example is, this is what's called illusion here. So basically, you ask the student to say seat. They say seat. Now say seat but say seat again, but don't say s, and they say eat. This goes on. This goes on in varying levels. But we want to be sure that students are not just decoding words, but that they also have some flexibility with sounds, that they can manipulate sounds, just sounds. Phonics involves learning the consonants in the language, the fact that there are digraphs, 2 letters that only make one sound, that there are short vowels and the sounds of those short vowels, and that's at the beginning, and then moving on to long vowels and consonant blends and eventually multisyllabic words. And those are all of this is part of teaching good phonic instruction. So sounding out a word helps students to blend and segment sounds as they learn to map sounds to letters. And that is a crucial strategy that we want students to do when they are first learning to read. So if you're looking at top, there are 3 sounds, t, ah, p. And you can tap it out on your fingers or on the table, or if you can just say the 3 sounds and blend them together, that's what needs to happen when you're decoding a word. So I often remind students, even students who are more advanced and struggling with a word, use your sounded out strategy. It's perfectly fine. That's what it's there for. Not just when you're beginning to read, but it's there to help you. So the phonemic skills that are needed for reading is blending. So you need to be able to blend sounds for phonic decoding, like k, o, a, clap. But then there's a certain amount of analysis that's needed in order to remember the words. So this is some of the work that I was referring to before. The phoneme deletion and substitution. Say good. Now say good again, but instead of good, say would. That gives a certain analysis that seems to really, that it helps students to really map sounds and letters in a way that helps them remember. So phonic decoding is really important, but some of these other activities, and they're kind of like word games, are actually really useful. So this is orthographic, what's called orthographic mapping, and this is one of the more recent activities that we've learned is very useful in reading intervention, that allows the reader to, secure the spellings of words in memory. So they develop an internal template so they can read words by sight and spell words and sort of generalize the pattern. So when they form really complete connections between letters and sounds, they can then begin to read words from memory. And here, for example, is we have phonic decoding, which helps you identify unfamiliar words, word identification. So that's, we blend sounds together. It requires letter sound knowledge skills, but then orthographic mapping is what we need to have word recognition. So there's kind of two going on here. You need to be able to, for permanent word storage, you need to sort of analyze words on a lot of different levels. Now, some people can do this automatically. For some of our students with dyslexia, we really need to be very purposeful by choosing activities that are going to encourage orthographic mapping, which is so important for more permanent word storage. In addition, to spell and write that needs an understanding of letters and letter patterns. Letter formation is really important for early literacy development. And I think that schools that abandoned handwriting instruction have made a great mistake, because we have good research that shows that teaching students to form letters in a way that's legible and practiced is really facilitates early literacy, learning to read and spell very well. We teach handwriting in the lower school at Groves Academy, and we take it very seriously. And it's amazing how much that helps students develop, again, a really internal representation of the symbols and the sounds that they stand for. So again, one of the things to do is, helping children develop an awareness of how printed words function. So being able to name the letters is important. Learning that printed words go in this particular direction. And so English and European words go from left to right, but Hebrew and Aramaic words go from right to left, and Asian words go from top to bottom. So encouraging children to name letters and to name sounds as they're writing letters is really useful and helpful. So learning the code that represents sounds and how those work. Here we have specific, we're looking at words that show transparently the word structure. We have 3 sounds, then 4 sounds in a word, and then we graduate to syllables, where we have publish, and then we begin to learn that there are suffixes that change how the word is used in a word. And all of these are aspects of written language that need to be taught pretty explicitly. So English, as I said, has a lot of morphology in it. In fact, it's known as a morphophonetic language, um, which so you can see we have suffixes, we have doubling rules, we have prefixes, and the more you know about a word, the faster you're going to read and comprehend it. And um, the the understanding how word use changes with prefixes and suffixes, looking at multiple meanings, how and vocabulary learning, some cases Latin roots are part of the journey to skilled reading. And fluency is something that you can work on a lot at home with students, and it's really important. Fluency is basically the ability to read with speed and accuracy. So it means basically fluency is a result of being able to process sounds and the letters that stand in for those sounds, how fast they can process, how working memory can help. But regardless, fluency is essential for comprehension, and we find that as students' rate of reading increases, so that comprehension tends to go hand in hand with that. Fluency gives us the time to think about what we read. If we're so busy trying to decode words and reading really slowly, we can't think about the meaning. We only have so much cognitive load that we can manage. So if we're focused on decoding the words and trying to get through the text, we don't have the cognitive space left to really analyze what it is we're reading. So that's to become a skilled reader, fluent reading is important. Now, somebody asked before about, about were some types of reading harder for dyslexic students than others. Really important that for developing readers, that they're reading books, stories, etc., that they can where they can read a certain percentage of the word. Like if you look at this here, the research base for consists of findings from, and you have no clue what this is talking about. In fact, this is basically what was trying to be said here. Nobody can read that and make any sense of it. So trying to ask a student who can't read enough words to read it and understand it is an exercise in frustration for everybody. On the other hand, students can often read passages where they know most of the words, but maybe not all of them. And again, here you can almost make out what they're talking about. So what I recommend in terms of reading material for students who are learning to read is that they can read 80% or so of the words, and that they have regular oral reading practice that's not timed. They just have experience with reading text orally. And best is to have somebody with them who can help, who doesn't ask them questions and so on, but basically who is there with them, who can just give them the words that they don't know and help them and answer questions if the child doesn't know what the word means. So frequent and consistent practice, like 10 to 15 minutes a day, possibly, and giving them support for decoding unfamiliar words. Not that they have to, sound it out or something, but just to give them the words so they continue to have that experience of fluently reading something. And expression is more important than speed, but expression won't come until they're more skilled. And so and that practice, I'm just going to go back there. This is practice that there's been some good research on how to encourage fluency, and oral reading is really the golden door for that. And that they actually, just process the text, and we just want them to be able to read it. You can stop and discuss, you don't have to. And asking them questions about what they read I would leave that to teachers to figure out how, how to ask those. We don't want to fire questions at them. We really want them to be able to process as many written words as possible. And it's because that practice of reading, they'll get exposed to familiar words over and over again. So they become very, word recognition improves immensely. So here we are back to the simple view of reading, which is all we've kind of talked about, all of these different parts to that. And interestingly, there's some recent research that is done, very well done research that tells us that the simple view of reading doesn't maybe tell the whole story. It turns out that executive function plays a role in becoming a fluent reader, as well as in being a good comprehender of reading. Executive functions are those cognitive skills that help you organize, plan, remember, persist in a task. And the research has shown particularly that working memory and cognitive flexibility have some effect on both decoding and reading comprehension. We don't really know what to do with this in terms of instruction or intervention yet, but I find it fascinating, and it's something that that I think will come, just as we've been able to develop really effective interventions for so many other aspects of reading. And I mention it only because I love to read research, and this is really this is kind of a new area that I think will probably yield some very interesting methods for us to use eventually. So let's talk about how dyslexia is diagnosed. If you suspect your child has dyslexia or a learning difficulty, they need to have a psychoeducational evaluation. You can do that privately, or if you're in the public school system, you can request an evaluation. What the psychoeducational assessment includes is, cognitive potential and processing. That could be like sort of like an IQ test. And then achievement testing, which involves, phonological processing, word decoding, how fluent they are, how well they comprehend and spell, and some math, speech and language sometimes too. And the final report should provide test scores, as well as the report should have a narrative that explains those scores and offers recommendations. Now, if the report's from a school district, the diagnosis may not include a diagnosis of dyslexia, and it may be called a specific learning disability in reading, but it's basically the same thing. And in the state of Minnesota, the state has declared that dyslexia is allowable and should be used as a term for failure to learn to read and spell. So if you are interested in having a copy of this presentation, you can, what you can do is email Joanna, and she will have a PDF of this and can send it to you, and you can perhaps look at some of these resources. I am going to ask now if we have more questions.
Yes, we do have a few.
Good.
First one is from Amina, and it says, my son is doing Orton Gillingham with highly qualified instructors, but writing is impossible. Is it okay to just teach him how to read since he has dysgraphia too? He is starting to hate the writing part of OG and we are stuck.
Yeah, well, you know, there may be some reason. I understand that and I know it's painful. However, spelling, the most important thing you can do to teach a child to read is to teach him to spell. So if there's, if the writing is, if the writing part of OG, the spelling of words, is really difficult, and it's worth considering, that your tutor may be able to offer some alternatives. One way to do that is to show him words first and have him copy the words and say the sounds of the words of the letters instead of just the sounds. So in other words, if he's writing the word, say he's writing the word ship, then he would write, as he writes SH, he says ship, and get him so that he doesn't have to rely so much on memory or some of the, Orton Gillingham can have a lot of rules and concepts that are hard for some students to remember. So possibly giving him more strategies to, and offer slightly variations and so on can help him develop, maybe good phonemic awareness that may help him with the spelling.
And then if anyone else has questions, please submit them. I only have one more right now, so
okay.
Get them in while you can. This next question, is there a link between ADHD and dyslexia?
No, not that we know of. There's a big overlap between dyslexia and ADHD, but they are not necessarily connected. Now, having said that, more recent research, people with ADHD usually have some difficulties with some executive functions. And given the fact that we're now looking at research that shows some effect of executive functions on decoding and reading comprehension, maybe there's more than we knew. But I do think that that ADHD and inattention can really affect reading and spelling instruction, if only because lack of attention and distractibility are going to interfere with interventions in instruction.
All right, well, that is, looks like one more just popped up.
Okay.
How do you help a child become a better speller if they are a decent reader? My child can read many words, but often misspells words when writing. We are overseas and don't have access to testing, so we've only had a dyslexia screening, which indicates moderate to severe dyslexia. How would you recommend we proceed?
Yeah, the scientific reading instruction will always involve spelling. And so this is not uncommon at all to see kids who can read pretty well, but their spelling is pretty atrocious. And what you want to do is to help them develop a better sense of the sound symbol connection in a lot of different ways. So if you have access to a tutor who knows Orton Gillingham or something like that, then that is that's a way to go. And then because reading instructors can do some assessments that show, and some spelling error analysis that can then identify concepts sort of to work on. I also really love a program that's called Spellinks, which is a word study and spelling curriculum. It is a speech to print approach as opposed to the Orton Gillingham print to speech approach, and it largely works through spelling and the sounds and the words, and that's a wonderful program for somebody like that.
Okay, that is all the questions we have.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for coming, and those of you who haven't heard this yet, if you've been recording and listened to it, I'm grateful, and thank you so much for your interest.
All right. Oh, I have one more that just popped up.
Okay.
Have any online resource games for students who have a hard time spelling?
Well, I would explore Reading Rockets, and there's a link to it there. There actually is a good spelling word game that's part of that we use. It's developed by the people at Learning by Design, who also have the Spellings curriculum, and it's called Word Up, and it's available. You can buy it from you can buy it from the Apple store. It's designed for the Apple iPad. So if you've got an Apple iPad, you can get Word Up, and it has 4 different themes that work on. Some work on spelling patterns. Others work on suffixes and prefixes, morphology, and there's a variety of different. There's like 4 different games, and it's keyed kind of to the Spellings curriculum, but I mean it can be used by anyone.
All right, great. Well, thank you again, everybody. Ellen, thank you so much for presenting this evening.
Sure.
And if you missed some of my introduction this evening, if you are an educator, we do offer CEUs for these workshops. So look in your email tomorrow night. You'll get an email from me. So just respond to that email and I can get you those credits. And you'll also get access to the recording and the slides for the workshop tonight. Thank you so much.